So I figured we're going to start first with introductions, so we'll just start this end of the table. So if you could just please tell a little bit about yourself and your connection with critters and monsters and creatures, and also while you're at it, just kind of talk about maybe a monster that inspires you or that you think is really cool.
So I'm Kip Rasmussen. I'm a freelance Tolkien illustrator. I have work in the Hobbit DVDs for the Peter Jackson versions, and in David Day's Heroes of Tolkien and the Dark Powers of Tolkien. So let's see, the creatures that inspire me. Well, you can't paint Tolkien without three things which appear in pretty much every book, which is spiders, dragons, and Balrogs. So that's kind of something that I have gotten into, not necessarily because I'm a big dragon, Balrog, or spider guy, certainly not a spider guy, but you know, you can't paint Tolkien without this kind of thing, so that's something I do. There's werewolves in Tolkien too, did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
In Silmarillion.
Nice.
I'm Dustin Hansen. I've worked in the video game and film industry for about 25 years as a concept and visual dev guy. I recently started freelancing because I was tired of living in Orlando and in California and wanted to live in lovely, quiet Utah. So for the last 6 or 7 years, I've been mostly working as a freelance guy. I'm currently the head creature designer, concept guy for a group called Evermore in Linden, if you guys know what that is. If you don't, you will. It's awesome. It is awesome. It's pretty fun stuff. And I'm also an author illustrator. I illustrate and write this series called Microsaurs, which is kind of goofy kids book that's like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids meets Jurassic Park. And then I have some nonfiction books like Game On, which is the history of the video game industry. Another one called The Fat Artist, which is coming out in about 2 months. It's kind of dispelling the myth of the starving artist. So it kind of talks about how to make a living as an artist and all the different areas of the art. One's coming. Oh, favorite creature?
Yeah.
Oh. Usually the one that I'm getting paid to design now, currently. It's terrible, but I am a huge dinosaur nerd, like ridiculous. For a while I thought I was going to be a paleontologist. Like, I absolutely love them, and so a lot of even the creatures I design now are based on those fundamentals and understanding of dinosaur anatomy. So I'd probably have to say an Allosaurus is probably it.
My name's Devon Dorrity. I own a software company for a living, so I don't make my living in art, but I've done art my entire life, and a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to take up sculpting, and I won the Chesley Award in 2014 for that. It's given by the Association of Science Fiction and Fantasy Artists, and I've been in Spectrum 4 or 5 times now, for those of you who know what the Spectrum Art Annual is. And so I've done pretty well in a short amount of time, but I love creatures. I don't get very far. My other second love is I love the human anatomy. I love human anatomy. I do figure sculpting. I meet with a group of people. We have models come. But I just can't get all the way through without adding a wolf head or something. So I love the fantastic. I love creatures.
Problematic in the portrait business.
Yeah. So anyways, and as far as my favorite creature, I agree with him. It's whatever I'm working on. Right now, I'm working on a Minotaur, so I love Minotaurs.
My name is Kaitlund Zupanic. I mainly like to illustrate dragons and other fantastical creatures. Usually just doing a few illustrations for Paul Janess's novel, the Iron Dragon series, along with a couple other things. And I'd say my favorite creature is probably a dragon and or a griffin. Those are my favorites right now.
My name is Howard Tayler. I write and illustrate a comic strip called Schlock Mercenary, and if my voice sounds familiar, that's because I'm also part of the Writing Excuses podcast, and I'm the guy who came up with 15 minutes long because you're in a hurry and we're not that smart. It's a haiku. Because I'm awesome. Been drawing now, I'm completely self-taught, I'm a hack. Been drawing now for close to 20 years. And I think the most inspiring creature art-wise for me was H.R. Geiger's design for the alien. Not because of the anatomy, but because of the otherworldly blending of plumbing and flesh that we'd never seen before. And now you can look at a thing and you can say, oh, that's kind of Geiger-esque, and everybody knows what you're talking about. My other is, whatever new creature of the week has caught my fancy, and this week you can Google this. It's Pigzilla, which is a giant wild pig perched up looking into a dumpster. It's that big. And the thing that's so fascinating about it, if you really look at the picture, is not, oh my gosh, that thing is huge. That's got to weigh 800 pounds, and the feet are like this big around, these little tiny peg legs behind it, and it just looks absurd. And I enjoy seeing that kind of thing in nature because it inspires me to draw stuff that feels absurd, but I know will work because, hey, the pig could do it.
All right, so before we get too far into it, by raise of hands, how many people are here because they're maybe thinking about coming up with a creature for their book, like they're coming from a writing perspective? Okay, and how many are here that are more from the art side of things and they're wanting to paint and draw cool things?
Can you get your hands all the way up so we can tell? You don't have to be shy about this. Artists, hands up. Writers, hands up. Filmmakers, hands up. Video game people, hands up. Okay.
All right.
I've got the information I need.
Okay, so let's start with the concept. So I think what we'll do is we'll just kind of give anybody who wants to can just weigh in. So first with the concept, how do we come up with a concept for a creature? Are we approached by an author and being asked to do something, or if you're an author and you're trying to get an idea, how would we suggest going about conceptualizing your creature? Who wants to weigh in first?
I'm telling stories. I'm writing a long-form space opera. And I know I need to introduce an alien. In the story I'm currently working on, which is a bonus story, it'll go in one of the books, I need aliens that are really big because the story requires that finding a place for them to sit down and eat is problematic. So there's this plot purpose that says they have to be big. They probably also need a lot of food. And so I'm going to design a big vegetarian. I haven't designed it yet. It's probably not going to look like Pigzilla because, insufficient fingers and no eyebrows. But there are story constraints upon what I'm building. From there, I just work with whatever looks cool. And often it's shapes. Is it a triangle? Is it a square? Is it, a pile of circles? And then I work from there.
Can I build on that?
Sure.
I love that. That's such a good example of kind of where a lot of these things start. And I know from a concept or visual development side, that's pretty common. Like I'll work with writers that'll say, here's what I need. And for me to start with that, I think that's a great description. I've already kind of got some things in my brain going. Probably most of you do, right? Gigantic vegetarian. But when I go from that, what I like to do is start to ask myself really honestly, being a gigantic vegetarian, what is that going to do to your skeletal structure, your mouth, your teeth, etc., right? Because if we look at the difference between a vegetarian mouth, not an omnivore like us, but a vegetarian, right? We're going to probably be talking turtles, cows, stuff like that, right? Their mouth, and their teeth, hippos, right? Mouth-jaw structure is dramatically different than if we say a predator or meat eater, that kind of stuff. So those kind of details really do fit into trying to explain the narrative of what your visual design is. And if you say big vegetarian and he shows up with a snout like this, your viewer is going to know you didn't do your homework, right? So those cues really do help kind of build the anatomy of your
Alternatively, if you say vegetarian and you require a snout like that, there is now a story element that says these guys eat artificially this way because of some other story purpose, and it's weird, and it might be comedy. And since I'm writing comedy, I'm not going to make these things look like werewolves because that's not the joke, but that is the sort of thing that also drives the story.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, I think visuals fit the narrative. you know, and other way around too. Sometimes, if from a writing perspective, if looking at, you know, digging through Pinterest and typing creatures, you can often, you know, build nice big libraries of stuff that you like that inspire you, and you can put those into your narrative. And my suggestion is really to look at that and say, why is that why are their legs shaped the way they are? Right?
Kaitlund, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What does Paul ask for when he says, draw me a dragon?
Usually he kind of has a little bit of a base put together on his covers, so I kind of have to stick to what Cyril, I believe it's Cirillo, who did the actual covers. But there's a couple of them where he's just kind of like, you can have fun. Like, he saw one of my sketches that was a Barbaroussa type dragon. I had actually been surfing Pinterest, and I found a photo of the Barbaroussa. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing
know what that
It's
is.
a pig, but the lower teeth actually grow through the skull and curl as big, huge, arcing teeth that come up through its jaw.
So Barbaroussa is an actual animal
Yes.
with mouth problems. Okay.
Yes, with mouth problems. And he really liked the idea, so I took that and ran with it. Oftentimes, I'll just be searching Pinterest, like you said, and just creating archives of different animals. And so if I'm looking at, say, a carnivore like we had been talking about before, I'll have a slot of just all the carnivores that I can think of, wolves, everything, and I'll just go through that in different sections to try to see what looks most like what I think this dragon would look like. With Paul, I have a little bit more of free reign, which sometimes you'll have, sometimes you won't. It just kind of depends on what type of creature you're building and what your client wants.
I'll add to the Pinterest idea. Several people have said it. That's, for those of you not familiar, Pinterest is a social network that is based on collecting images and just pinning them on boards. And if you don't have a Pinterest account and you're an artist or an author, it's not a bad idea to get one, because it's a really quick and easy way to come up with ideas. Typically, like if I decide, well, I'm going to sculpt a werewolf, you may think that it's all been done, and yeah, it's all figured out, but there's actually big debates on whether or not werewolves have tails, and how their legs are shaped and just different things. And so in this case, I tried to do a quintessential werewolf, so I tried to take advantage of the stereotypes and tropes and stuff, but usually the first thing I do is I start looking it up on Pinterest, and I'm like, okay, what has been done, what's out there? And as I start looking at the ideas, I can be like, okay, I like this guy's take on it, and I like this person's take, or I like this little piece of this one. And then you can kind of start developing you're just getting the creative juices flowing. And then, and then maybe at some point you'll develop an opinion like, oh, if I could just get a creature that had, the eyes are like this one, and the mouth is like this one, and the nose is like this one, then you can kind of start piecing together an idea. And if you're a writer, and you're trying to come up with this idea, it might not be a bad idea to find an artist friend of yours to maybe piece it together for you and get a decent sketch, and you can kind of come up with your creature Bible, what it looks like and all that kind of thing.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I was just going to ask because what he said and what you said prompted me to think, how do you think you would go about creating something that's completely unique? Like you said that Geiger had done. He did something that hadn't been done before. I mean, because in a sense, it sounds like y'all are talking about looking at existing things and from there getting ideas as to where you might go. What would be the process for completely unique, it's not based on anything you might know of?
You know what?
Or is that not possible?
Just that holy grail, just give up on that, because anything you make is going to end up, whether you're conscious of this or not, as a synthesis of things that you've seen. If you want it to feel unique, then the more things you have seen, the broader the possibilities are for synthesis, and the higher the likelihood that you are going to synthesize something that hasn't been done exactly that way before. But novelty is not what makes these things awesome. The Geiger's aliens had, as I recall, digitigrade legs. They were just digitigrade legs. We've seen those before. There's nothing unique about that. But the rendering that he did on them we had never seen before, except electricians and plumbers. And so,
But people are working pretty hard to get unique creatures. If I can recommend a couple of things to budding artists, especially writers, there's a website called artstation.com, and in fact your brother was talking about that this morning, that has some of the pros who are doing all kinds of fantastical art and everything, and some really great stuff on there. But what was the name of the Tom Cruise movie? They renamed it. It's like Live, Die, Repeat or something. I can't remember what.
Edge of Tomorrow.
Yeah, Edge of Tomorrow, yeah. But they had a creature on there that was so immeasurably disturbing that I thought was pretty much a unique creature.
The Mimics.
Yeah, yeah. And I thought it was a tremendous beast and very, very disturbing. You were afraid of those creatures and how they could move underground and move very rapidly and all that kind of thing. I remember in the 70s coming up with reading a book by an author named Eric Frank Russell. This is probably the only place on earth that people would know them. Anybody know Eric Frank Russell? Oh my God. Oh, was there a hand?
Yeah.
So anyway, he had a creature that looked like oily ropes. And I've never been able to get that out of my head. And I don't, I've never seen it anywhere. I've never seen anybody, develop a creature that was oily ropes, and it was just very disturbing to me. I've never been able to get it out. It can be done. You just have to, see what's out there and use your imagination.
Yeah, like, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Like what you were saying, you just need to get as many creatures as you can that have the attributes that you think would work and would look nice and be plausible on that creature, and then mesh them together correctly or in a way that would seem more realistic. Because the more realistic your creature seems, the more the audience is going to connect with it, and the more it's going to evoke that emotion that you want it to evoke in people.
Now, we're talking about the Edge of Tomorrow, I think is the name of the movie.
Something like that.
Those monsters, when I looked at them, my first thought was, oh, they've taken the form factor of that one Pathfinder thing and they've built it out of the squiddies from the Matrix movies. I immediately saw those two pieces. No, I hadn't seen that monster before. And yes, it was brilliant and beautiful, but it didn't strike me as
Totally unique.
It was made out of things that I knew I'd seen before. And that's why I say don't chase that holy grail. Now, don't just draw something you've seen before, but don't give up because every time you draw something, you can see where bits of it came from. Because jerks like me are just out there.
Yeah, I actually remember at BYU I took a philosophy class, and I think it was Descartes or something like that, way back when. He says, it's impossible for you to come up with something that you haven't had experience with before. And that was one of his main tenets when he attempted to prove the existence of God. It was fascinating, his argument, but one of the tenets was that you cannot come up with something that you've never had any experience with before. And so I think I think that's mostly true. I'm not 100% sure I buy it all, but I think mostly when you see these unique creatures, they're really just people borrowing and stealing little bits of what they've seen other people do, and they just keep adding it together and keep blending it up and mixing it in new ways until you come up with something, a combination that's never been done before, and then people are like, wow, that's cool. And then somebody else takes that, puts it in their blender, and then they make their own critter based on that. And so, I guess what part of what I'm trying to get to is, even though sometimes it's fun to take a new spin on a different animal. Don't just immediately jump. Well, I'm going to write a monster book, or I'm going to paint a monster. I'm just going to do a werewolf or a dragon. I mean, there are ways to make it fresh. There's ways to do unique spins, and it's okay to come up with something that's unique, so that people look at it and are like, "What is that?" I
don't think I've ever seen a feathered werewolf.
You should follow Bobby Chu on Instagram. You'll probably find it. Yeah, it's interesting because I'll bet you, I'm not joking, I'll bet you we could find one really quick. The other thing I was going to say that's an interesting thing, how many of you guys remember that video game called Spore that came out? Yeah. And the creature creator became like everybody's favorite thing, right? So the interesting thing, so I actually worked on that project many years ago. One interesting thing with that approach to that project was, even though it was visual, it was definitely visual, it was based on solid scientific information. Right? So if you're going to add creature legs to a certain model, we had to know from a development standpoint that we could animate that model procedurally. We didn't have the time or the budget to say they're going to change the shape of the femur bone versus the tibia, and how would that work. So we built these constraints and limitations that from a physical and from an anatomical standpoint made actual physical sense. And yet, people are still creating unique, bizarre creatures with that tiny little tool set. And so I think we're all saying the same thing here, is there's a lot of information out there, and combining it and monkeying around with it to kind of get unique, bizarre things is part of that whole process. And it's okay to lean on reality. There's some neat things there.
It's super useful. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, you have all of these tools to your advantage. Use them. It'll make it so much easier if you don't take shortcuts, try to rush through creature building. Do a couple iterations of your creature. Just take a little bit of time, do, say, 3 versions of the creature and what it would do, and say you change that a little bit. How does that change that character? How does it change what it does in its environment? Don't just rush to the very first one that you create. Try to play with it and mold it.
One of the most useful tools for me is knowing the words for things. Show of hands, how many of you knew exactly what I was talking about when I said digitigrade? Okay. Let's talk leg types real quick, and I'm just going to stand up. The Pigzilla has what we call unguligrade feet, which is where the fingernails have turned into hooves. And this whole joint has fused, and basically it's standing on this. It's standing on that. Digitigrade is what your cat has, where the fingers are toes, and it's planted on the toes. I say planted, and then there's your feet and my feet and bare feet, by which I mean bears, not our feet bare, which is plantigrade, which is this, and the toes and the toenails are at the end. Knowing those words is not an exercise in vocabulary, it's an exercise in putting hooks in your brain so that when you see a picture of something you like, you can say, oh, that's got digitigrade legs, but the way they're working is kind of interesting. You are going to remember more visual information with those words than you would remember without them. I'm not telling you that you have to go out and study an anatomy textbook, but if you read a little bit of this and learn what these words mean, the synthesis process is going to be much easier for you, because you can just say half a dozen words and then know what it is that you're mashing together.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think same kind of thing. If we talk about kind of the anatomy, studying anatomy book is a great idea. Right. Like for every kind of anatomy you can imagine.
Yeah, animal and
yeah, for sure. And like to me, one of the biggest things that when this clicked for me, I was pretty young, kind of realized the difference between the occipital arch goes over the top of your head and how it gets placed differently if you're a predator or a prey. Right? So we're kind of bizarre. We are the most bizarre in the animal kingdom. We stand and we put our big lumpy head on top of everything, and we can't see anything anywhere except for right here. The fact that we're predators is unbelievable because we are built like prey. But when you look at like a deer, where their eyes are in comparison, it changes like their entire field of view. Right? Putting eyes on the side of your head and making them a lot larger makes you look more innocent and more tender. And more, so it's all kind of part of that. Like if you're trying to develop the personality or characteristics of your character, it's good to know the anatomy that goes behind that. Why we respond different to different critters.
And can I just add to that how important it is, I think, for the visual artists, especially the younger ones in the room, to pay attention to the texture of the surface. So as a dragon painter, I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of images of dragons. One of the most interesting things I ever ran into was the neck of a snapping turtle. And I said, that is a texture, that is a skin type. And so I've tried to borrow that for my dragons. And you know, like I said in a previous panel, if you want your creature to look like a porpoise, then don't do anything, you know, and that's fine if you want it to look like a porpoise. But just be aware of the texture that you're going to get on that skin, because it's super important to your look.
Since we were on the topic of anatomy, you know, the class, you know, has anatomy in it. So how important is anatomy? We mentioned it a little. It depends on what your goal is. I mean, I think if you're a writer and you're trying to come up with anatomy, and you're trying to figure out how far into the anatomy should I get, well, I think that depends on the story and the role that creature plays. And if it plays a big enough role where its anatomy becomes a major focus, as it did in Geiger, you know, an Alien and stuff like that, then I think they, you know, whoever wrote those stories, you know, took a long time to define really what the anatomy would be and how it would work, and it's silicon-based instead of carbon-based, and just different things like that. I know from an artist perspective, I try to get my stuff looking as, you know, as realistic as I can, and because I'm doing anthropomorphic art, you know, which, you know, mixture of human anatomy and animals, a lot of my art tends to do that. Sometimes it's just a pure creature like a dragon or something, but even dragons, a lot of dragons art you'll see will borrow little bits of human anatomy to make it work. But like for the werewolf here, I mean, I had a dancer from Utah State come and pose for me, you know, and you learn the muscles, you learn, you know, the obliques and the different muscles in the back, teres major, teres minor, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, you know, all these different muscles. You start learning where they are, where they go, and it adds a sense of realism to your art that makes it more believable. And at first, you just start getting those muscles to the point where it's like, oh, like a comic book artist would do it. Every single muscle in the whole body is flexed, and it's, you know, and that's kind of how the comic book guys do it. And then you get further in, and that's the way I did it here, by the way. I did it on purpose, though, because I'm trying to make a werewolf that's in mid-transformation, and his muscles are seizing. But that's the idea. You can learn to tell a story with your knowledge of anatomy by determining which muscles are flexed and which muscles are relaxed. You can tell which direction the arm is moving. And if you get it right, those kind of subtleties can add some really a sense of dynamicism or dynamicness to your art, because we become experts in reading people's body posture, and so sometimes when we're doing art, that's some of the first things we see that's wrong, is when the gesture doesn't really match, doesn't fit. And learning anatomy will help you do that.
One of the challenges that I've had with Schlock Mercenary was manifest during the RPG project we did, where we hired some artists to draw some things, and one of them was the Ursamari, which are sapient, you know, uplifted polar bears, and the other was the Neophants, which are first generation sapient elephants. Elephants have been sapient for a long time, but this is the first generation that has the ability to walk upright, and where they've opened up the front stompers, feet thing, whatever those are called, and given them fingers. And the art that came back kept having human musculature through the shoulders and back. And I had to tell him, look, I don't want this to look like the comic book Elephant Men, I think is the name of, there's a comic book that has big muscular. I want this to look like, and I went and got a photo of an elephant on its hind legs with the front feet. If you've ever seen an elephant, you know, it kind of looks like a meerkat that can't get it all the way up. Reaching, that came out wrong. You know, reaching up. But when you look at it, the thing that strikes me is that, you know, my shoulders, I can't even do this with my shoulders because of the way they're planted, but the elephant's shoulders are down low. It's just so sloped the way it looks. And I said, you got to give me sloped shoulders, and then when you do that, don't give me human sloped shoulders. Put the muscles in other places. Make this look like an elephant that's been bent into a position that's unnatural but is somehow working. Artists were kind of frustrated with me because I was so specific. And in many cases, when you come out of the comic book school of flexing all the muscles at once, even though you're not mid-transformation, it's hard to step away from human anatomy because that's just what you default to.
Yeah, and yet you see bears, you notice they don't have shoulders like we do. And that affects the way they move and the way they run and everything. They're much better at running than we are. A bear can outrun you any day. That's why they tell you not to run from a bear. You just play dead because they'll outrun you because their shoulders are so forward like that. They're designed for doing this number, when they're running. And ours aren't. But ours are really flexible. We can move our arms in ways that a lot of animals can't because of the way our shoulders are built. I remember talking with Larry when I was doing this sculpture, Larry Korea, about the werewolf and wanting to know what his take of it was. And we had decided that since the things use their claws really heavily, there's a lot of animals use claws, but to what effect can he use tools and everything? And after a lengthy discussion, we decided to give him human, that part of his anatomy.
And there's nothing wrong with that because it started out as a human.
Yeah, very good.
But it shows you the difficulty as an illustrator or somebody who's interpreting an author's vision, because he's saying, well, make it more like an elephant's anatomy. Well, you got to go look at an elephant's anatomy. Then you can't just keep guessing, or the author's going to keep saying, send it back, do it over.
I love snapping turtles, by the way, because when you look at a snapping turtle's neck, they have weaponized the thing that has the brain at the end. What a terrible compromise. This is just a bad idea. But it works. Take your finger.
So, in both in terms of art and in terms of literature writing, how realistic do you think creatures can be? Is it okay to make a creature that's just flat out impossible? That you just can't figure out a way it would work in real life?
I think in the right property, sure. I don't think that this Edge of Tomorrow creature had any kind of. I don't know if you could slow it down and see what kind of working joints they had or what have you. I don't think it exists. That's what I think made it so disturbing, is these were time-traveling creatures that could figure out what the humans were going to do and then subvert that. So I think in the right property, sure, it doesn't necessarily have to make sense because that's essentially an alternate dimension.
Mutation and experimentation
Yeah,
as a theme can really let you explore that kind of stuff.
I didn't like the squiddies in The Matrix because they moved like they were swimming, and yet they flew like they were using anti-gravity, and there was no justification for the tentacles beyond rule of cool.
I agree.
And I think that's one of the reasons why the second two movies weren't as much fun as the first ones, because those things sort of knock you out of the film. Actually, I guess that squiddies were in the first movie, we just didn't get very much of them.
Yeah, I was thinking I played Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid.
No.
Yep, amazing. That led to my obsession with creatures, I think. But there's a creature in that world called a beholder. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
This floating little ball of eyeballs, and then there's a giant mouth. And when it opens its mouth, you're pretty much seeing its entire insides, and it's hard to really understand, well, how would you actually try to make the anatomy? And I've seen a few artists do a beholder where they actually put like a jaw, because usually there wasn't even a jaw, it was just like a mouth.
Like backbone.
Yeah, it was just like a mouth that just kind of opened, but they didn't actually see any bone structure. And I've seen a few artists do it with like a hinged jaw that opened and closed, and it kind of ruins the spherical perfection of it. I guess my question is, even though it's a ridiculous creature, does it work? Can you still write a scary novel based on something that's just completely ridiculous? And does the artwork look cool? And if it does it matter if the creature is impossible?
I think the beholder falls into the category of some of the Lovecraftian creatures, where part of why it is scary is that when we look at it, our brain tells us that it can't be real. There's no way that eyeball is, it's like I can see behind the eye. I don't even know what that, well, maybe the mouth is extra dimensional. Maybe, I don't know, but that aspect of horror grows really well from creatures that our brains refuse to interpret as real. It's difficult to draw because the moment you draw it, the reader can picture it and doesn't see the problems you see. But when you describe it in the text. I think Tolkien's description of the Balrog, it was a creature made of flame and smoke.
Smoke and flame, yeah.
Creature made of smoke and flame.
A lot of ways to go with that.
That's okay. Yeah, there's a lot of latitude there, and what was depicted in the films beautifully captured a creature made out of smoke and flame. But if Tolkien had looked at that and then described it, he would have said, it's a demon with a cape of smoke and flame. And so with prose, you can do things that as illustrators we can't do, because you can take concepts that just aren't going to work together as creature and force us to contextualize them as a creature.
Yeah, I think but also kind of part of visual development's a little different because you're usually building something that somebody's going to build, right? So I mean, most of the work I do ends up being pretty rigid because it'll go to another artist and build it for you. As opposed to illustration, where sometimes the stuff that I love about illustration is sometimes the most powerful stuff is the stuff you leave out. Like making those decisions of saying, what am I not going to show here, and letting the user or the reader, in the case of the prose, fill in those details. I think that's a really powerful tool to use as an artist. But the other thing I was going to mention, kind of based on what you're saying about the unbelievable creatures, is if we look at a microscopic level, there's some really bizarre, cool stuff because gravity doesn't affect it anymore. Right? When you get beyond that point where gravity doesn't power you, the spores are unbelievable. You should look at them microscopics; they're amazing. Even like the tardigrades, which most of you have seen.
I mean, don't do this if you want to sleep well, but do this.
Well, and along the lines of that, I was wanting to do mandibles of spiders that were entirely different than any that had ever been created. And so I began to look at parasites, intestinal parasites, and there's some stuff of nightmares, but it's the stuff of our reality. It's on us, and it's out in the oceans and all that kind of thing. And so yeah, you can draw inspirations from some pretty bizarre things that actually exist.
We had a question. Go ahead.
Well, actually, that reminded me, John Carpenter's The Thing.
Yeah.
That is a horribly terrifying creature that is very simple.
Extremely disturbing.
Because it operates on a molecular level, and it mimics whatever it absorbs.
Yeah.
And even like the remake,
That's a great example.
How many of you guys familiar with Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings? Yeah? Yeah, Spren?
Hey, you guys know who Brandon is?
Yes.
Checking.
Yeah. So there you go. He's got it right there. Way of Kings. So he has these things called Spren, and they take many different forms and many different shapes, and they fade into existence and fade out of existence based on the emotional state of the people that are around them. But it turns out, you find out they exist in a cognitive world, and when you go there, they look very different over there. And their anatomy's not the same, and they're not remotely the same as ours. They don't have blood, they don't have anything. So there are ways that you can make creatures that will completely defy our understanding of any sort of biological life form. He has in one area of those books creatures that have what they call gem hearts. And you kill the creature and you can pull out their heart, and their heart is a solid gem. So how does that work, And it turns out that instead of using blood to move stuff around, they use stormlight. These creatures, and stormlight's a type of power, and you'd have to read the book to go further. But they're powered by these gem hearts, and so they're hunted for these gem hearts. And so they're creatures that just defy all of our current understanding of biology. So even though it's sometimes very cool to follow the rules and say, how would these shoulders work, and how would the biology of these creatures work, you can throw all that stuff to the wind and just go a completely new direction.
If your property demands it, it fits.
I was writing a short story for Privateer Press where the protagonist's point of view character is a mechanic who works on warjacks, steam-powered, fighting robots. And the warjacks in this particular story were a model that has the ability to, jump in ways that a steam-powered contraption just flat out should not be able to jump. And my story hinged around sabotage of the warjacks. And so I had to go to the designer and I had to ask him, where's the power coming from? How's it being transmitted to the legs? Is there a rocket pack? What are we talking about? And he said, basically what's happening is the steam power and the magical energy that's been infused by the Warcaster are hitting a rune plate, which is altering the mass of the warjack long enough for it to jump. So, okay. So, and then I started giving him, because I'd been looking at steam engines and diesel robots and things, and I start throwing out parts names at him, because that's how this character is going to think about it, because this character has to find the sabotage. And I described this to him, and he's like, oh, that's beautiful, run with it. But until he told me how the magic works to get the robot up in the air, I couldn't write the story in a way that was believable. I was very pleased with it when it was done, because they came back to me and said, nobody has ever gone into this kind of detail on the guts of our warjacks, and I don't think anybody ever will, because it's so scary.
I actually work in that industry, so yeah, that's actually no one I've never heard of. And I've been working in it for 5 years.
The Privateer Press?
Well, wargaming in general.
Okay, yeah.
So that's a new one for me.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes. The last thought that we have, we kind of hinted on it a little bit earlier, but maybe we could hit a little directly as we kind of give our closing remarks. But that's, how do we break the molds? How can we try to avoid rehashing the same thing? Because I think what makes our art remarkable, or our stories remarkable, is to push the boundaries of what's been done before. So as I think I'm just going to go down the line, have anybody you can give any closing remarks or pitches for other panels, but before you do, hit on this one topic. How do you break the mold? How do you what's your one piece of advice for moving forward?
I would, if you're an artist, I guess this could apply to writers as well, as I would just get creative. I mean, I would draw. Figuratively speaking, if you're writing, just keep digging. Conceptual artists are drawing all the time. If that's what you want to do, you really need to do it. You really need to hone your craft and your creative edge.
Yeah, I think be open to feedback is what I would say is kind of the big one, and get yourself involved with people that can give you the feedback that you need. You don't need mom hanging your stuff on the fridge. You're not going to get any better with that, unless your mom is like really good. But really, find people who can give you feedback and be really open to it, and that's on the writing or the illustration side.
My suggestion is to learn to lie a lot, and what I mean by that is tell your story, but don't be true to it. Meaning, as you're telling people about your creature, feel free to embellish. Keep doing it. Talk to more and more people, like he was saying, and as you're doing it, embellish, and whatever keeps their attention, then go with that the next time you tell it. And then once you've told your story enough times to enough people, and you've come up with a way of describing your creature, or a way of visualizing it that seems compelling, then run with it.
My input for you guys would be to create a library. If you have one, make it bigger, much bigger. You think you have enough information, double it. Just always be on the lookout for new information, new things, whether that's a actual physical copy of books or a digital library. You can never have too much information when you're world building or creature building. Always just have it at your disposal.
And Howard, close this down.
If you document the process by which you are creating a thing. So you're creating a thing, and then over here you enumerate the steps that you went through. Just do that, and then come back to it and look at this list in your process and ask yourself, why did I decide that? Why did I decide that? Why did I decide that? As you do that, you will find that some of your decisions were just, because that's the default, that's obvious. That's the one that you need to rethink. That's the one where you need to start asking, what were the options? Why did I default to this? Why did I make the texture of the skin on the elbow look like every other elbow I've ever seen? Well, because it's obvious. That's what an elbow has to do. Is it really? Couldn't we make elbows out of Jell-O? And I'm done.
All right, thanks for coming, guys.